Welcome to the Animation Industry Podcast. My name is Terry, and there's a hole in the big toe of every sock that I own. This chat is with none other than animator, artist, and director Laurie Rowan, who is best known from me sharing all his really cool Instagram posts in my stories. But actually, he's world-renowned for his very quirky, loopy, and super cute 3D animation style that has gotten him client work from the BBC, Disney, Google, MTV, and so many other clients, and picked him up numerous accolades like a Children's BAFTA win and a super coveted Vimeo staff pick. In our chat, Laurie's going to share how he left his job to pursue his own animation style and how that made him go viral on social media, which in turn led to a full independent animation career. But first, this episode is sponsored by Cloud Stop Motion, who've created possibly the easiest way to start animating from your phone, tablet, laptop, or desktop in seconds. Simply go to cloudstopmotion.com and click Start Animating. Their software works in any modern browser and your files are instantly stored to the cloud. And the best part is that they are completely free to use, up to 500 megabytes of storage, which is actually quite a lot. They're especially useful also if you're teaching a class, since you can create an organization account which comes with 2 gigabytes of free storage as standard and allows the creation of unlimited student groups and profiles, all of whose projects and work you can view for yourself from your admin account. Go to cloudstopmotion.com to see how easy it is to get started. Now, without further ado, let's jump in. Hi, Laurie. Thank you so much for coming on the chat. How's it going?
Yeah, good. Thank you. How are you doing?
Super great. Yeah. So I'm super excited to talk to you because you're somebody kind of that I sort of aspire to be like. Like I super like just love how you've developed a style, and it's gotten recognized to the point that you've been able to do so many cool things over the years. So maybe just take me back to when you seriously decided to pursue what you're doing versus, becoming a farmer or a computer engineer or, something else. Like, take me to the point where Colonel Laurie was like, you know what, seriously going to consider pursuing this really strange, amazing art that I have in my head.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. Firstly, I've been animating for a long time now. I think probably about 15 years. And it's only the last, I'd say, like 5 years that I've done stuff in specifically the style that you'll be familiar with. So there's about a 10-year period before that where it was completely, not that.
Oh wow! So did you? So did you go to animation school and you were like working in a studio and stuff? No,
I didn't go to animation school, but I did a degree in media production, which kind of touched upon it, and it was more focused on film really, or film production. So kind of sort of stepping into documentary a little bit. But animation is something that I always did, just habitually. Anyway, so I was animating as a kid. I used to play my dad's old video camera, and this is a long-winded non-answer to your question, but
no, it's great.
It was always something that I kind of just naturally gravitated towards, and in the way that some people would maybe music, it just sort of seemed to be my natural skill set. But I mean, when I went to uni, it was 2003, and I hadn't really identified animation as something that was a valid career choice. The internet wasn't what it is now. There wasn't all those outlets. I just thought cartoons were just on television.
Yeah.
That was an impenetrable other thing. And I just enjoyed doing it for fun. But then it was when I decided to take it seriously and do it as a career, it's when I started to get a little sort of glimmer that it could be done. And without a lot of context, right? I think it was something along the lines of seeing like a Don Hertzfeldt animation on YouTube, like quite early YouTube, and thinking, oh, okay, so that's something that's not, specifically Hanna-Barbera or any other big studio. It can be done by a single entity. And then I was just, after I finished uni, I carried on doing the job that I was paying my way through uni doing, which was doing the commentary on this dolphin game on a pier. It wasn't making me particularly happy. Yeah. I left that to pursue what I thought was a real job, which the criteria is quite low at that point. That was just something that involved wearing a tie and being indoors. Was the kind of the lofty ambitions I had. I worked in a call center for a little while, and I'm really glad I did because I really, really didn't enjoy it.
So
I
okay,
really
so
didn't.
you just said you weren't really happy doing what you're doing, and then you decided to pursue
Yeah,
something with a tie indoors.
that's right. Yeah, because I was working outdoors on a you know on a pier, just sort of with this racing game behind me doing the commentary, doing like
Yeah.
which is good in the summer.
So you have a
It's not
great
a long-term thing.
speaking voice and like can entertain a crowd, I guess.
It's a long time ago. But I had and it's not to say that I was fantastic at it either.
Yeah.
It's sometimes I'd get into the spirit, but other times people would just come and find a grumpy guy reading a book, just have to go, oh, okay, interest or like some of this sort of carnival atmosphere out of nothing. But yeah, it was just I worked in this call center for about 6 months, and I couldn't stand everything about it. I mean, the main thing was the timekeeping down to the minute. I remember having being called in by one of my supervisors saying, it's come to our attention that you've been 2 minutes late across the week
Oh my
from your
goodness.
lunch. This kind of thing.
That's
So I was like, right, well,
craziness.
oh yeah, it was just, it was
Wow.
just a
So,
absolute
so,
mess.
you said you did animation for 10 years before you developed this style. Can you tell me more about how you got into that? Because you didn't go to animation school. You said you took like media.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's always in fact. So that basically the long one to say that was the way of like kind of having the most miserable job was really early on was a blessing in that I just had to go and make an assessment about what I actually wanted to do.
Yeah.
And I had the benefit of being able to go to I was 21, and I saved up a little bit of money and said to my parents, can I just move back in for a little bit because the place I was living, Brighton, was prohibitively expensive. And just want a bit of time to reset and just kind of think, okay, what I don't feel ready out of university to go and get my first job. Let's just take a little bit of time to figure out what it is. And it was animation. Um, so I downloaded as many job applications as I could about animation. I just made a big checklist of the things that are required for a sort of entry level position. And then I made a website where I tried to just exhibit all of those.
Wow.
Essentially, one page, like it had a landing page with a kind of Victorian train going through a landscape and then into this landscape, which has got some hallmarks of the sorts of things I'm into, contorted angles and that, but it's this. I think it was probably very much influenced about where I was. I'm from North Wales originally, which is a very rural landscape and a sort of a village which has a lot of Victorian features. So,
Nice.
incredibly literal. It was like a distorted version of that went onto the screen and had this thing of a kind of train pulling up onto a platform and a guy getting out of it, opening a suitcase, and the menu flew out of that and adorned the screen.
Oh,
And it was just
wow.
absolutely non-functional. But it was
Was
kind
this
of like,
3D animation?
no, it
2D.
wasn't. It was Flash. It was
Flash.
2D Flash
Yeah.
animation. Yeah. With some it's like a mixture of Illustrator, Photoshop, and Flash. And I think that was the kind of extent of the repertoire at the time. But it worked. And then, sort of 3 months after having done that, I got my first job in a
Wow.
studio.
So that was enough. Just showing this like train through the landscape with the menu coming out. Somebody was like, we need this guy, entry level, done.
Pretty much. I mean,
That's impressive.
yeah,
I love that you downloaded every job application, looked through the qualifications, were like, I'm gonna get these. Because a lot of people start with just like, what do I have now? And then try to fit that into job applications. But you did the opposite. You're like, what are people looking for? And then you just gave it to them.
it's the luxury of time. Yeah, so I was very lucky to have that bit of time. But I mean, also, like I say, it's something I always gravitated. So even though I didn't have a professional repertoire of work. I had been working on bits and pieces. I had enough to go. Although they did ask me for another sample, they're like, "Have you got any other bits?" And that was one of the things. Is nothing was kind of everything was just little tests. It was just little bits that sort of established themselves and then ended, or just kind of one character on a blank background. Nothing was complete. So it's just kind of in the spirit of the time. I was like, yeah, absolutely. And they just panicked and just kind of tried to make something. Made us made like a 15-second film of a robot
Wow.
pooing a big ball bearing, basically.
Wow. That
Yeah,
sounds
There's reoccurring
Magnificent.
themes in my work. Yeah.
Yeah, I would hire you if I saw that. I'd be like, this guy's creative, funny, and
Scatological.
he likes
Yeah.
robots. Done.
Yeah. Yeah.
So then you spent the next 10 years working in animation. So you started off as maybe a Flash animator, and then you like were working for studios. Like what are some of the projects you worked on during that time that you
Um,
got to the point where you're like, screw this, I'm gonna do my own thing now.
yeah, it was. I worked for two small studios before I went freelance, so it was very eclectic. I mean, one of the things, the first job I went in for, there wasn't any kind of. We were all feeling our way. So, I mean, one of the reasons that I got a job straight off like that was because, the studio didn't really know what they were doing. It was. I'm not going to say the name
It's Pixar now.
because no, because it's certainly not Pixar now. But I mean, I don't, the people who ran the company didn't really have much of an interest in animation, other than the idea that, owning IP is good, and that's what they ultimately wanted to do.
Yeah.
So they just hired people that sort of seemed on paper to be the right thing, and we sort of muddled our way through and came up with our own pipeline. And it was a bit, we went further than we should have done, because
Oh, hey,
probably the
it
absolute
also got
truth.
you your start. So like maybe you needed somebody who
Absolutely, no, it was
didn't.
really good in that, and
Yeah.
everyone is there has gone on to better things. But we sort of muddled through, and our first job was it's kind of a medium that doesn't really exist anymore, which is these short uh, clips for mobile phone.
Mm.
Well, it doesn't exist anymore because we have smartphones. We didn't back then. We had like these tiny Nokias, and the really novel things you just got video on mobile, and so people would spend something in the region of about, I think it's something like $6 to get like one clip, which is 30 seconds long.
Oh yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, and it had the same sort of effect as like people gathering around a campfire, just going, look at this. Like, can you believe it? It's small and moving. And we made a series of those clips, which, it's crazy to think that people would value something like that so much. It was a
Right?
pre-existing TV show, and we just extract things that would be considered, single jokes from a longer narrative, and then we'll just take the audio from a DVD and then reanimate it in Flash. And that really was that's the way I learned,
Wow,
was
that's
that
crazy.
project. It was like a year and a half of just doing that with this set of characters. And the really good thing about that was that it wasn't just a case of kind of making something move and just getting something that was loosely resemble human movement. It was, you had specific characters who had specific sets of movements and characteristics that you had to match
Mm.
and then exaggerate. And so if you were to watch that series that we made back, you'd see something that started as not fit for purpose. And by the end of it, I think something that was, relatively established. And so that was the first thing. And then just very luckily, there was a local team making a TV show for Channel 4 um, in the city, and they came to us, and we animated on that. Um, and then as a studio, we did some more work for Channel 4 and then some stuff for the BBC. So, the kind of all the larger commissioning bodies in the
Yeah.
UK.
Okay, cool. So the studio's coming a little bit more well known. You're getting a lot more experience. At what point did you start diving into 3D? Because now all of your stuff is 3D. Was that
Yeah,
during your 10-year tenure as
yeah.
well?
That was just by necessity. I remember the specific thing I needed to do was there was one animation that required like an ice cream van to drive around a corner, and because the designs of the project were quite geometric, it made sense to, rather than just redrawing it frame by frame on the production schedule we had, just to learn enough 3D to make this thing move around, and just the novelty of not having to redraw something
Yeah.
um, was great. So I did 3D for a while, but what I did to start with is I'd never really, I don't think I had the confidence to fully work in 3D for a while, and for that to be the end product. I used it as a kind of, what I was terming at the time, as sort of a backbone of just making traceable assets, and so run cycles and things like that, and just for foreshortening, and so just purely for reference. And then it started to take over. And but I mean, I was predominantly a 2D animator for most of those 10 years.
Do you ever feel like going back to 2D now that or you're just like, nope, done, moved on?
Case specific, I think. Like the thing that I really like about 3D, and the reason that I choose it for the stuff that I do and the stuff I'm familiar with, is just I find it hard to recreate that same sense of physicality.
Hmm.
So I think the shadow form, the weighting is really important
Yeah.
to what is the kind of the essential joke of the piece, which is these,
Yeah.
the sort of the wobbly movements. So I think it's something you can do in 2D, certainly, but it wouldn't have
Totally.
the
Yeah,
same
yeah, I
effect, I don't
understand.
think.
So tell me about tell me about the moment where you decided to quit all of this experience and career that you had made for the last 10 years and go completely freelance. Like, did you have work coming in where you were like, you know what, I'm just gonna, like, this is enough for me to sustain myself? Or did you make a conscious decision to pursue your own art?
No, I think when I became freelance, so that was about 7 years ago. My timeline's not going to completely add up because I'm kind of just plucking it out of my head. But so yeah, that was about 7 years ago that I went freelance, and it was due to redundancy at the
Hmm.
time. I was very lucky that the studio that I worked for just kind of closed down, and it held out for a long time after the crash, but a lot of studios in the area went down, and then I think about 3 years later we were one of the last ones to go.
Hmm.
And so there's a lot of us at the same time, and we all went freelance, and then were able to pick up some work through contacts at that previous company. So I kind of left with, I was kind of pushed, but I
Hmm.
welcomed it because it was something I've been thinking of for a while. But I think it's always one of those things. Which like, I'll do it one day. I'll do it one day. Um, and I don't know realistically if I would have jumped if it wasn't pushed. But yeah. So basically, I became freelance, and I ended up doing exactly the same kind of work that I was doing for studios.
Huh.
So
Did you have
yeah,
clients lined
but
up, or did you suddenly you were just pushed out of this job with nothing and you're like sitting on your couch being like, now what?
no, I was back to work
Ah,
within a month. So I had work lined up, and
just
but I mean the
from
stuff that I
like
was doing at the
from where
time.
though?
Sorry,
From just clients from the studio, that because the studio was down, they needed somebody to do
yeah,
it. Ah,
yeah,
okay, I see.
yeah. So it all came part and parcel of that. Yeah, the right contacts, the right people, at the right time. Um, but yeah, it was the same kind of work. So the stuff that I was doing at that time, I'd started off like very early in original series stuff. And then by the time I went freelance, I was doing kind of third party stuff. So a lot of web, um, like children's games, that kind of thing, in browser games, and um, app design for shows by like Nickelodeon or Disney, or that kind of thing. And so then that's what I did for about 2 years because that's what my
So you're
entire
already pretty well
job.
established, known if you're designing stuff for Nickelodeon and Disney. Like they're looking to trust somebody who has experience and like a unique creative directive and stuff like that. Like, how did you get them to trust you versus, I don't know, they could have gone to anybody else?
Well, I mean, I guess that's holding a lot of weight that way, designing for, because you'd have a design Bible and you'd match
Mm,
it. So it was very by the road, and it was always kind of third party. They were hiring the studio was hiring me. Um, so it's always smaller studios based in Brighton or
yeah.
London. About as far afield as it went at that point. Um, it's because I had a portfolio of a lot of it, basically. So all the stuff I'd done, and we were small teams as well, the place I was working. So um, I was mainly the lead on anything I'd worked on at that point for the last couple of years. So yeah, I mean, I was a kind of a safe pair of hands, I think, and that was kind of demonstrable. There's just a lot of it. I'd be working solidly day in day out on this stuff for years by that point.
So when did you decide to move? Well, I don't know. Maybe you're still designing stuff for like Nickelodeon, Disney, and third parties and studios and stuff. But from my perspective, it seems like you're doing a lot of your own unique style. Like at what point did you consciously decide to start pursuing that? Because you've done Pictoplasma, you've done like you're tons of like spots, like all this stuff.
Yeah, it was funny enough. You mentioned Pictoplasma. It was Pictoplasma that
You've
sort
got
of
a poster
was
on
a
your
kind
wall
of
right there, so I
it's, it's
couldn't not
yeah, well,
mention
yeah, of
it.
course, it's pretty dominant, isn't it? Where did you pluck that from? Yeah, it was. Oh, when would it have been? It was I don't know, it was the year before that. So 2017 is I went to Pictoplasma for the second time. I'd gone when I'd worked at a studio back in 2013. But I went in 2017, and I kind of always aspired to do my own stuff, but it was kind of really tangential. I didn't know really what that meant, and then going there and watching all these artists speak, it was made me incredibly inspired and jealous that you could have a sense of autonomy in your work. I hadn't really. I remembered starting with that aspiration, but I'd forgotten that that's what I wanted to do, and I kind of
Yeah.
and I've tried it in different ways, but I always known that I'd wanted to do something that was kind of based around comedy and animation. I'd been a stand-up comedian for a few years before that as well, so I'd work in the studios, and then in the evenings I'd go and do
Oh
some
wow.
gigs, and it was an open micer really. Like,
Yeah.
it wasn't
That's still
you
super
know,
fun.
established. It was, but it was kind of I guess that was a kind of that was a reaction to animation being something that's so laborious,
Yeah.
to then the opposite end of that spectrum is something that can be not created on the night. It's pre-scripted, but has that performative element, and kind of, you can play with it.
Yeah.
So that was my creative outlet, and I kind of stopped doing that, and then going to Pictoplasma sort of reminded me why that was and how I'd always intended to bring these things together. Um, and it just kind of just instilled in me kind of, well, has to be now, really, doesn't it? So I came back and then just set myself a project to just start animating, putting things out. And the thing was to stop doing these little tests,
Yeah.
because that's what my Instagram feed and any web presence I had beforehand was just, I wasn't figuring it out. Like, why is this not really getting people's attention? It's like, oh, it's because it's like one head turn and nothing else,
Yeah.
or, some guy walking across the landscape with no other context. And so I kind of thought, okay, well, what I'll do is I'll bring together the different parts of kind of what I've learned through animation, but then also I think the stand up was really important to that, because I would say, and it's hard to have an outside perspective of your own work, but when I have tried to look at it and deconstruct it, I think it's that each piece that I put out, each animated piece, firstly has its own internal logic, so it doesn't require any further explanation.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that it resolves, and it has basically the construction of a joke format.
Okay.
It
I
has
think it's
some
interesting to me that you see your, like, I've never heard anybody describe their animation as like comedy before. Cause like when I look at your animation, you've got like super smooth loops. There's like, it's its own little world. All the physics is kind of, it makes sense, but it's a little off. And then you've got like super cute characters who are like it makes sense that it's comedy, but like, are you telling punchlines with your animation, or is it more like, the whole piece in itself is kind of a play on something?
probably the worst person to ask. I don't
Oh
know. Like,
no.
it's sort of no, no. I mean, it's good, but it's like kind of, it's put together in a kind of half a sort of fugue state. I come up with the kernel of an idea and then see where it goes, and
Yeah.
there's the plan, and there's a level of improvisation around it. And
Huh.
I would say that it kind of my preoccupation generally is to make things funny.
Yeah. I mean, I think it
Whether or
is
not
like,
that lands or not, I don't know. But
yeah.
it's kind of, and part of that, I mean, I guess I've got a very loose definition of what is a joke or what is comedy, and I think it's I would call the kind of I don't know, the proportions of a character a joke.
Okay, fair.
If
Yeah, yeah,
something's kind of awkwardly long-limbed, that's my
yeah.
definition
Totally.
of a
No, I
joke,
love
or
it. I
off
always feel
kilter.
like every time you come up with something new, I'm like, it's like super curious to me, and it's like fun and silly and a little bit absurdist, and just like, I don't know, it's just very interesting to watch. But I'm gonna start thinking about it as a joke and see how I perceive your work now, because I think that's really cool. So okay, so you started developing, you were like, hey, I need to stop doing tests, I need to do something more complete. So you were actively trying to get more attention to your freelance work, and just through this exploration you developed this style? Like this style doesn't come from like you know, childhood drawings or like influences from other things, or like it just kind of developed on its own from what you were noticing was taking off? Because I guess I'm wondering, like, how do I intentionally get a lot more of attention to my work? Because for me, I have this conflicting thing where I like want to stay in this style that I love versus like, you know, what actually gets the attention, and how can those two things merge? Because you have a lot of, you know, you have tons of followers on Instagram, etc. You've got like accolades coming out of your who knows what, like
Yeah, I don't know. It's I do know. I'll get to it.
okay.
I'm just stalling for time. But I mean, I don't know. There's a distinction you drew there between like kind of working the style that you love and what will be popular, and I don't know if that necessarily existed for me.
Mm,
I do think I kind of came into it naturally. There were things that inspired it, like you know, Bauhaus is a bit like the sort of structure, the strong silhouettes of Bauhaus and the sort of the color contrast within that. That's definitely there. Um, Part of it was actually, I think, previously the stuff that I'd done and the things I was referring to as kind of like endless tests were just stuff that was over ornate or that I would never finish, had more of a sort of comic book sensibility to it, you know, or it's kind of I was obsessed with kind of getting too much gradation of tone into something that's animated and not really playing it out over kind of like, okay, so how much work would it take to actually make this come to fruition as a piece of animation? So it was really a very conscious effort to go minimalist with it. So the first test I did was actually, it was more about time. I did this kind of, this weird little test that's not kind of, again, it was a test again, but halfway house between kind of what my style was, which was a bit more grotesque, I guess, back
yeah.
in the day, compared to what I'm doing now, which was this guy that was kind of like sort of upright worm thing with little wiggly arms, and he just sort of shakes, and that was sort of notionally funny. He looked kind of nervous, or it was kind of, I thought it was funny that that there's something going on, there's some physical reaction, there's some emotion being displayed, but you're not entirely sure what it is, and it's abstract enough that anyone could kind of engage with it in however they find it. But the main thing behind that is like, how quickly can I do something that has some kind of
Mm.
empathetic core? And so it was literally just kind of making the mesh for it, really, really simple, and then adding some physics to it so that when the center sort of wobbled around, so I'm using a lot of non-verbals here, when the center wobbled around, the limbs kind of flapped around with it, and it took something in the region of 2 hours, and I deemed that a success.
Nice.
And then after a little while, that stopped becoming the criteria when I figured that actually probably things need a little bit more attention lavished on them.
Now you're spending like 16 hours on just the face.
Yeah.
Oh no.
No, well, it's always changing. I mean, a lot of the thing that
So when you made this conscious decision to start, you know, what you just described, where you were like taking things a little bit differently, did you start to see an uptick right away in how people were giving attention to your work?
it's quite quick. Yeah,
Oh
like
wow, okay.
I mean, I'd say it happened probably across the course of a month. So
Wow.
yeah, it was quick.
So then how
But I
did
mean,
oh
yeah.
sorry.
No, no.
So how
Go.
did social media impact, because you know, your career in this sense? Like has it given you opportunities from creating these things that people were reacting to specifically, you know, work on MTV spots and like do magazine illustrations and stuff like that?
I'd say it is entirely irresponsible. Yeah.
Entirely. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I'd say so.
Okay. At what point
Yeah.
did you start to notice? Because like you have 40, almost 40,000 followers now.
Mm.
And for instance, like I have like 5,000 followers, and like job opportunities, I've gotten like one in the last like 2 years. And it didn't even flush out from my Instagram, for instance. So like at what point did you start to notice that you would get job opportunities from your Instagram? Like, was there like a threshold of like hitting like, I don't know, 1,000, 2,000, 10,000 followers that you started to notice?
No, I mean, I guess when I say it's entirely responsible, I guess it's entirely responsible for getting the first wave of interest that would kind of start to take it out of purely that. So I guess that's a bit of a contradictory statement, but it was like when I start, I'll just say when I started posting things, I came up with the rule of I post one thing a week,
Wow. Okay. So the
and
discipline.
yeah, and I just sort of and at that point as well, if I didn't have work on, I wouldn't really actively pursue it if I could afford not to, So
Yeah.
I'd allow the time to do this sort of thing, and that's the balance I've kept throughout since. As always, except for the last year when I haven't had a chance to do as much personal work as I would have liked. But that's a good problem to have. What's the point of making two? Yes, okay. So like, yeah, the first couple of animations didn't do a lot beyond what I would get before, but it was sort of measured in terms of likes. So the first one was like 100, and at that point, that was the most I'd ever got. And then the next one was a couple of hundred, and then it was about four in where
Wow.
I did the 4 or 5 where I did the spinning head that sort of reveals smaller faces
Yeah.
inside
Yeah.
them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's since I use that as my logo, and that's the kind of that became sort of the main character of my piece, the reoccurring character of everything I do. And at that point, it started to get a lot more attention. People first it was kind of compliments from friends who had previously never even mentioned anything I'd done, and sort of voluntarily said, "Oh, I like this one," which meant a
Yeah.
lot to me because
You're like,
no one
hey,
had really said that.
I'm here.
Yeah, arrived. Um, but I submitted it to a blog as well, a blog called Boom with like 7 O's.
Yeah.
Boom, yeah,
With all
and
the O's.
with so many O's, and I was really self-conscious about that.
So you were
And
just like, hey,
well,
hey guys, like I made this thing. I'm proud of it, but I'm really self-conscious of it. Would you feature it or something like that?
it with less words, yeah. I just kind of
It's hi, like
yeah,
this, please, bye.
yeah. I said nothing. Like it was they have an open submission
Yeah.
policy, or they did at the time. So put it in front of them, and I was really surprised that they were really really responsive to it.
Huh.
And in fact, they had a YouTube channel which didn't really have anything on it at the time. They said, well, could we put it on that? And so it actually stayed on the Boom like sort of sidebar for a few months, just kind of permanently there as well.
Wow.
Yeah, so that was a hell of a thing. And then after that, after a few more animations, the blog It's Nice That got in touch, and they wrote a feature on these shorts.
So you'd only done
And
4 animations and then you got a feature written about you.
a few more, but it was
Wow.
quick. But I mean, there's illustrations in amongst that as
I've
well.
noticed that. So I've chatted with a bunch of people on this podcast, and it seems like when somebody decides to discipline themselves and say like, I'm going to do something every day or every week, that's when things really start to change.
Yeah,
Yeah. So like,
because it was, yeah.
fast forward
I was just
now.
saying,
So like, you know, I guess 2021 is over. Can you get like, what was the year for you? Were you doing a mix of like, still the directing and stuff for the Nickelodeons and whatever, and then also like a big mix of, making your own art and freelancing your style?
um, I tend to just work in my style now. So I
Wow.
have done. That was the that was the turning point. I think like a couple of years ago, um, more self-styled stuff took over
Amazing.
what I was previously
That's
doing.
that's so cool.
Um,
Congratulations.
oh, thank you. Yeah, yeah. No, and 2021 was it was purely directing really. So
Amazing.
I
So
direct through Nexus in
So
the
tell me,
UK.
okay, so you just worked for a year or two doing just completely your own style. Are you working towards something specifically? Because it's like at the beginning, you had this very directive approach to saying, I want to consciously become a freelancer after listening to that talk where you felt inspired and jealous.
Yeah.
So what is there a next step now for you? Or is it you've reached this like, Zen state where you're like, I love doing what I'm doing and I'm just going to keep doing this?
Um, no, there's more. I think there's
Yeah.
it's there's always the struggle of kind of I think like a few years ago, and that was the thing to mention about the pixel because the posters there as well. So like I was really inspired by it, and then the next year I designed the posters for it, and the year after that I spoke at it, and did
Amazing.
some
Yeah.
installations and stuff. And that was the big thing. But the reason I mention it, the one thing I really struggled with when I was sort of doing the talks was the kind of the intangibility of what I was actually doing
Hmm.
in terms of kind of like, well, what is the product? What is it attached to? Is it enough that it's these things that go out onto social media and people respond to them? And what context does that sit in? You know what I mean? It's kind of so it's always been a search for context. So it's kind of like,
Okay.
where do these things fit? What larger vessel do these things make up? And
So like what you maybe let me interpret what you're saying. Like I guess as an IP, essentially, like your style, how does it fit into the world? Like is it a TV show character? Is it a just a style that appears in creative magazines? Like do you have an answer or something you're trying to work towards? Because when you think of like there's certain artists that like stand out and you're like, oh, I reckon like Banksy, for instance, like where does
hmm,
his stuff fit in? But you know exactly what it is, I guess. It's graffiti essentially. But like, are you
yeah,
trying to be like kind of like that, where your stuff is like kind of here and there and everywhere and influences little things here and there?
no,
No.
I don't think so. No, I'd like it to be something finite. Whether or not that's a kind of
Okay.
TV show
Interesting.
or something along those lines. There's a bank of characters, um, something a bit sort of longer format. I think I'm very interested in doing work for young children because
Interesting.
I have one now, and
Yeah.
so I'm kind of seeing a lot of the world from that perspective all the time.
So maybe
Um,
for like, if you're comfortable discussing, I guess like what is your makeup of projects currently? Like I know I've seen, because I've like followed your Instagram, I know that you're here and there and everywhere, but like thinking about the last year, like what were the main sources of like, maybe like work that you ended up doing?
I did a few illustration pieces. So I did a piece for Google quite early on in the year. I did something for Upwork, a piece
Okay.
for the web, and then I've been doing some direction work through Nexus,
Right. Oh
who
yeah, I wanted to
represent me
ask
for my
about that.
directing work. So yeah, I did a couple of projects for them, so advertising projects for
Okay,
them.
so I guess like looking back, your style mainly lives in like uh commissioned illustrations
Yeah,
and
yeah,
not
yeah.
so much the animation, even though it comes from animation.
Well, I mean, they just take a lot longer.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's only so many you can do throughout the year. But I've done towards the end of last year, I did quite an involved one for a company whose name I can't remember right now.
Oh no,
Yeah,
that's okay. So
uh, but yeah, but that's purely myself. But that's also my style's kind of
so
style
maybe this is why
changes
you want to
depending on the
move more
resources I
towards
have.
animation and something more permanent, because that's where it comes from. I'm okay. So just maybe a side note, I was interested in how you got you're repped by Nexus. Like how did that happen? How did they sign you? Or like I don't know exactly the stipulations. And then how has
Hmm.
that affected your career?
Um, well, I mean, they must have seen my stuff online.
So they
Um,
just reached out to you. They're like, hey,
yeah,
Laurie, we like you. You want to come work for us? We'll send you some directing gigs. And you're like, yes, please.
I think it was the picture class and the lineup had been announced at
Oh,
that point,
wow.
and I
Okay.
was kind of and I was quite visible on it. So I think that might have had something to do. And I had a meeting with a few people at the time,
Hmm.
and yeah, it was very fortunate to be able to kind of make a choice. And I went for Nexus because we talked about just to being able to transition into that basically, and
Yeah.
sort of, because I guess I wasn't previously interesting title of being a director as opposed to just kind of an animator. And I suppose the distinction for me is how solitary that experience is. You know,
There. Yeah.
and that's one of the really good things that working with Nexus, they've got an incredible production team, and
Cool.
so the capacity of your work or the vision can really scale up depending on how many people, how many specialisms you can get involved. So that's
Totally.
been
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
most pleasurable thing in the last year, I think, is just being able to kind of to upscale these ideas.
Nice.
or do something that's a bit more narrative based.
So that's awesome. Thanks for sharing. So looking forward, I guess this year, you said you want to get into something that's more permanent, and like figure out where your style fits. How are you intentionally planning to do that? Because I feel like you've reached a state where people are reaching out to you with pretty steady work, because you're pretty well known, your style is very unique, and it adds, like, as soon as you, at least for me, as soon as I see it anywhere, I'm like, oh cool, I know, like, this is awesome. It like stands out. So like, because you could take this next year and just say, like, I'm going to go with the flow. I've signed with Nexus, people are going to reach out to me, I'll do illustrations. But if you're planning on intentionally moving your art into something more permanent in the world, how are you, I feel like this question I'm asking is like 5 minutes long. How are you going to make that happen?
And it's kind of, you say your question's 5 minutes long, but it's like that's the question that I perpetually ask myself across a period of months. So
Okay,
like,
well, let's
um,
let's answer
yeah,
it,
it's interesting. It's yeah. Well, let's please do it. Yeah,
and
I
then
don't know.
I'll
I'm
take that
finding
answer
it.
and do it for
I think
myself as well,
the
because that's also, I was like doing some planning yesterday.
yeah.
I'm like, how can I?
But it's the perpetual question, isn't it? I don't,
Yeah.
it's interesting. I don't know. The works first, I think, and that's, I mean, one of the good things is, or one of the things I'm really trying to do is just kind of, this might seem a bit kind of fluffy and esoteric, but it's just to kind of just clear some headspace to figure out what it is. So as
Yeah.
opposed to kind of the mechanisms of getting it out there, it's just to have something tangible to get out there.
I think it's so
So
interesting that you created this
the
style
answer for me
based
is just to
on.
do a lot of work.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there.
No, no,
Um,
no. Go on.
I think it's so interesting that you created this whole style that's become your online persona based on you saying to yourself, like, I want to become a freelancer, and then developing your style from this. And it was like that discipline and drive that created this. And now that you've got this thing, you're like, how do I take it to the next step? Like, what if you said to yourself, like, I'm gonna do this whole like discipline and see what works all over again to get to the next step, and it ends up evolving into something completely different? Would you feel like you had a loss of like this style that you've developed and kind of like everybody loves, or would you feel like you've evolved like a Pokemon into the next level just to see where it is? Like, are you looking to take this specific thing with you, or just go forward to the next thing? Does that make
I
sense?
think, yeah, I mean, it does make sense. I think, like, I don't think I wouldn't shed the style, like, because it's not something it's not that calculated, I suppose, in terms of it's kind of like I fill banks and banks of sketchbooks, and this is the stuff that comes out, and it gets more nuanced, but it's by repetition.
Yeah.
And I don't think there'll ever be a sort of a clean break on it becoming something else. It will evolve because things naturally do, but and I guess it'll kind of like to varying degrees of complexity, or depending on what it needs to do, what it's trying to express. Whether or not those ideas become more complicated, or the nature of those ideas change, and the character designs will probably change with that. But I mean, it's yeah. I think there would be a loss if it was a complete departure, because I don't see the necessity to do that. I think
Hmm.
it's if I unless I think the biggest departure would probably be to go into live action or something
Yeah.
like that, and
Oh,
not do
that's, yeah,
animation at
fair, fair,
all, but
fair.
do sort of like forms that are based around
Hey,
the
you've already
same kind of
made
kinetic concept.
material puppets and wooden sculptures and things of your 3D thing. So who knows? Live action with
Yeah,
puppets? I don't know.
I'd be up for it. Yeah, yeah. I've done CGI with puppets,
Yeah, yeah.
so
No, I think
it's
I think this is super
yeah.
interesting.
I've
Like,
been working on some stuff. I've got a 3D printer, and this will be for the video one, but I've started to work on new
oh wow, you've
production
made little finger
methods.
boots.
Made little finger boots. Yeah, so it's
Yeah. Well, that's a,
those are the kinds of things I'm playing with. I mean, that's one thing I want to do on sort of in terms of the social stuff. I am planning a kind of. I've not been as active on it
hmm.
for the last year as much as I'd like to, and like I sort of alluded to work, because work there's been a steady stream of work. I haven't really had the time to do that, but I
I mean,
want to take
that's
some
that's
time for that
great.
because
And bad for everybody following you, I guess. Great for you. So
Yeah, but I mean that's where you find it. That's the kind of that's the there's a lot of value in that,
yeah,
and it's what's probably the opportunities that I have so far, and it's what's always provided whatever is the next thing.
totally.
It's basically the function it has is for me to do my research and development in public.
Yeah,
That's what those things are.
it's super
So
interesting
it's a
for
very
me.
valuable.
It's super interesting for me to like hear your story, because like, I follow your work online and it feels very refined and specific and a thing, and then to know there's like 15 years starting at a peer behind this, and how it came to be
Yeah.
is it's very interesting to me. I'm wondering, like, if somebody's listening and they're like follow your work and they want to do something similar, what would you tell them to like really, what is a skill they should really develop to end up in a spot where you are? Like, say they've already got their art style, whatever, like maybe what's like a hard or soft skill that will really take them on a similar path to you?
I think the thing that sort of the hard won thing for me has
Yeah.
been to kind of to get a sense of what other people are seeing.
Hmm.
So as opposed to sort of just work away at something and go, oh, okay, that's something, and put it online, is to kind of
Yeah.
make an assessment of what this looks like out, like
How do
external
you
to
do
yourself.
that though? Like, how do you take yourself out of your own art and look at it with like a fresh third party perspective?
I think it's just to make a determination of, is it complete? And
Hmm.
if it is complete, what is it? So that was the thing of making those short clips. It's like you say, did it across the series of like 5 or 6
Yeah.
clips that suddenly garners this attention. But that is on the back of 10 years of doing stuff that's just little run-ups to it. And
Right.
it was that sort of clicking point of saying, I know this is super vague, but it's sort of like this is something. And it's that
Gotcha.
thing of it kind of like we were referring to before, the joke structure. Or, why is this one thing satisfying or needs to be seen by someone else? And it's such an intangible thing, and there could be a million answers for it, but you need one of them,
Yeah. No, I
and
love
that's
that. It makes so much
yeah.
sense to me, even though it feels vague. Like, can I look at my art and say this is complete? Or like, I like didn't really go to town on the background because I didn't have time for it, or like, I skimped on this because like whatever. But to take it and say like this is a finished product
Hmm.
and like deliver it, like kind of like that. Like if you're, I don't know, making dinner for somebody else, kind of.
Yeah, does it satisfy its function in that way?
Yeah.
It's like
Like
it's
you
sort
make
of if
dinner
it
and you're
goes,
like, do you want tap water?
yeah,
You're like, no.
yeah. I've got two constituent parts of the dinner, but no
Yeah.
carbohydrate. You need pasta or potatoes.
That's I like seeing your animation as a joke is like a new concept for me, which I want to think about more afterwards. And I want to like take a look at some of your stuff and like know that that's what the intention is. I think that's really interesting to me. And to know that each piece is like complete on its own too. That's really cool. I'm wondering,
I think.
we've talked about like the past, present, future, I don't know, stuff in between. Is there anything else that you think is interesting to share with people who are listening?
Oh, I don't know. No, I don't know.
No.
I
Great.
can
Done.
only
Bye.
respond to questions. I don't know. Um, well, in terms of what I'm doing,
Yeah. Or just
there's
in general, like if you think, I don't know, whatever comes to
yeah,
mind. Like if you've
there's
been
stuff
like,
coming up that I want to
wish we
talk
talked
about, and I
about this the
can't.
whole time. Like, here's your chance.
Right. Um, I just plan to do a lot more work.
Yeah.
So, I mean, one thing I'm really trying to drill that down into is to sort of take stock and, you know, answer those questions that everyone needs to pose themselves. And the one that you just posed to me, I don't have a complete answer to that, but it's just trying, So,
What is the
that's where I'm
meaning of
at right
life?
now. Yeah, that's what I'll address next.
Yeah.
Give some vague answer to. Um, no, it's I kind of I think recently I forgot how I kind of go a bit mad if I haven't got this output, you know,
Mm.
um, to do these wobbly characters.
Mhm.
Um, and I'm starting to get that back again. It's a hard thing to stay excited when you're not doing anything um, for yourself or has no real um, looseness to it. I suppose.
Yeah.
It's kind of, you need to keep that. That's one thing that I've started to appreciate because of the lack of it recently. Over the last few years, I really learned that creativity is a muscle, and idea formation is just by rote, just filling sketchbooks and trying to get something and get one good idea. But like, good ideas generally don't come in isolation; they come off the back of a thousand
Yeah.
insufficient ones, maybe. Or the fact that it's kind of the only way to get really good creative output is to completely let go of fear
Hmm.
and just do stuff that could be nominally terrible, and it just absolutely doesn't matter.
Fear in
And
like
it's
what? Like
something,
what sense? Like I'm afraid to draw this or like explore
I'm
this
afraid to
further?
do something that's rubbish, or I'm afraid to step
Oh,
out of my, I'm afraid to step out of my style because that's what people know of me, and
yeah.
if I go in the wrong direction from it, I might lose something, or that kind of thing. I think to be absolutely sort of loose and honest with yourself and your work is a really hard thing to do,
Yeah,
and it was
totally.
the longest lesson to learn as well, I think. So now it's, and in my rambling way, what I'm saying is I kind of over the last year I've just kind of been completely consumed with commercial work and not carving out a bit of time for that as well. I've remembered that these are easy things to say, but they're harder things to enact. And as soon as I get out of the practice or flexing that muscle of just drawing all the time, coming up with concepts for the sake of concepts, things that can springboard to other ideas that are really hard to find otherwise. I've learned the value of it from the absence of it. So that's my focus for the next year, is to kind of to reintegrate like a
Nice.
steady practice of my own work as well. To aid my commercial work as well. I mean, that's one of the things I found embarking on any commercial project. If there's a degree of looseness around the concept of kind of, you interpret this, you do what you want with it. If you're not primed to come up with those ideas, that you can have a nightmarish couple of days or I do in my case, of kind of
Totally. Yeah.
banging my head against the desk thinking I will never have another original thought again until like something pops into my mind. But historically, if I'm in the practice of just kind of doing the stuff myself anyway and being quite regimented about it, then it's a much easier place to be.
You're making me want to go draw in my sketchbook right now.
You should go and draw your sketchbook.
I might
Yeah,
just do that after this.
it's
I
yeah,
haven't
it's the
drawn
most
yet
important
this
thing.
year just because I'm like, it's like, I don't know, I have to get in the right mood and I'm like, what's wrong with me as I'm listening to you?
That's the thing. Yeah, it's getting in the right mood, isn't it? It's kind of and I really struggle with that. I was saying to a friend about it the other day, like when I'm at my most happiest, it's probably when I manage to achieve a flow state,
Yeah.
and the thing that I absolutely cannot be bothered to do is attune myself to get into a flow state.
Right.
It feels like it just
It
takes so
feels like
much. It's
so
kind of
much
like,
work. You're like, I
yeah,
could
I'm
just
gonna have to
like
sit
play
here and
video
draw
games
for an
right now
hour before, yeah. So it's
versus like, yeah. Oh my goodness. Well, thank you so much for sharing all that. I think that's great. And also I'm really excited to see I think it's really interesting to me that you've reached this kind of like turning point. Maybe it's coming soon or in the future, but like I'm really excited to see what you come up with next. I think it's going to be really interesting to watch how your work evolves or doesn't evolve at all, or maybe like retracts, or maybe it becomes rubbish, like you said. Like who knows? I'm
who
just excited to
knows?
see what happens next. Happens
Yeah,
next.
you've got to open yourself as possible, isn't it? There is some stuff coming up. I can't talk about it yet, but
Well,
there'll be
as
something.
we're wrapping up, do you have any final thoughts or anything else that comes to mind?
Um, no,
That's fine.
just
Totally
I
fine.
hope this
Hey,
has been
that's
value to someone.
that's great. It
I
means we've
sort of
exhausted the topic, I guess. Well, Laurie,
yeah.
thanks so much for coming on the chat. It's been an absolute pleasure. I'm really happy we got to chat. I've been following your work for so long, and like, I'm just happy to chat with you, honestly.
Very welcome. No, it's an absolute pleasure. Thank you. It's been great.
Yeah, thanks for coming on the chat. And if you're listening and you want to, reach out or follow Laurie, you can do so by checking him out on Instagram under Laurie Rowan, or the same laurierowan.com for his website to see all his work and some features and some other cool stuff that he's done. So that is all for now. Thank you so much for listening. Make sure you check out those links in the description of this podcast. And thank you again for listening, which I just said. Okay, bye. The music for this podcast was composed by Will Farmer and the graphics by Daniel Abensauer. I encourage you to look them up if you enjoyed their work.